Legionary. This video is the compendium of the second book of the Caesars de Bello Gallico. Book 2 of the Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar focuses on a significant period of the Gallic War in 57 BC, where Caesar confronts a widespread conspiracy among several powerful Gallic tribes, particularly the Belgae. This book of De Bello Gallico details how Caesar manages to suppress this large-scale uprising, demonstrating the strength and strategic capability of the Roman army as it faces some of the most formidable opponents in Gaul. Have fun. While Caesar was in Cisalpine Gaul in winter quarters, as we have previously explained, frequent rumors reached him, and he was also informed by letters from Labienus that all the Belgae, who we had mentioned as 1/3 of Gaul, were conspiring against the Roman people and giving hostages to one another. The reasons for this conspiracy were: first, they feared that, with all of Gaul pacified, our army would be led against them. Second, they were being incited by some Gauls, partly those who, just as they did not want the Germans to remain in Gaul for a long time, were unhappy with the Roman army wintering and settling in Gaul, and partly those who, with their fickle and unstable minds, were eager for new leadership, and also partly because in Gaul, power was being seized by the more powerful and those who had the means to hire men, who could not easily achieve this under our rule. Disturbed by these reports and letters, Caesar enlisted 2 new legions in Cisalpine Gaul, and, at the beginning of summer, sent his legate Quintus Pedius to lead them into further Gaul. When sufficient fodder was available, he himself went to join the army. He ordered the Senones and other Gauls, who were neighbors to the Belgae, to find out what was happening among them and report back to him. They consistently reported that bands were being gathered and an army was being assembled in one place. At that point, Caesar did not doubt that he should march against them. After securing the grain supply, he moved his camp and, in about 15 days, reached the borders of the Belgae. When he arrived there unexpectedly and more quickly than anyone had anticipated, the Remi, who were the closest of the Belgae to Gaul, sent envoys Aetius and Androgeus, the foremost men of their state, to him. They declared that they and all their possessions were placing themselves under the protection and power of the Roman people. They had not conspired with the rest of the Belgae against the Roman people and were prepared to give hostages, follow commands, receive the Romans into their towns, and assist with grain and other supplies. They reported that all the other Belgae were under arms, and that the Germans who lived across the Rhine had joined them, and their collective fury was so great that even the Susians, their brothers and kinsmen, who shared the same laws and governance, could not be deterred from joining them. When Caesar asked which tribes and how many men were under arms, and what their capabilities in war were, he learned the following. Most of the Belgae were of German origin and had crossed the Rhine long ago, settling in Gaul because of the fertile land, driving out the Gauls who lived there. They were the only people who, in the memory of our fathers, had prevented the Teutones and the Cimbri from entering their lands when all of Gaul was harassed, and they had great prestige and confidence in military matters because of this. The Remi claimed to have precise knowledge of their numbers because of their familial and political connections, and knew how many each tribe had promised to bring to the common council of the Belgae for the war. Among them, the Bellovaci were the most powerful in both courage and authority and in the number of men. They could muster 100,000 armed men, of whom they promised 60,000 selected men, and demanded the command of the entire war. The Susians were their neighbors, possessing vast and fertile lands. Their king in recent memory was Diviciacus, the most powerful man in all of Gaul, who had held dominion over a large part of these regions, and even Britain. Now their king was Galba, who was chosen to lead the entire war due to his justice and wisdom. They had 12 fortified towns and could promise 50,000 armed men. The Nervii, who were considered the fiercest among them and lived the farthest away, could provide 50,000. The Atrebates, 15,000. The Ambiani, 10,000. The Morini, 25,000. The Menapii, 7,000. The Calidi, 10,000. The Veliocuses and Viromandui, the same number each. The Atuatusi, 19,000. and the Condrusi, Eburones, Carosi, and Paemani, who were collectively called Germans, about 40,000. Caesar, having encouraged the Remi and spoken generously to them, ordered the entire Senate to come to him and bring the children of their leading men as hostages. All these orders were promptly carried out. He then urged Diviciacus the Aeduan to take his forces into the lands of the Bellovaci and begin ravaging their fields, explaining how important it was for the Republic and the common safety to divide the enemy's forces so they would not have to fight the entire multitude at once. After giving these orders, he sent Diviciacus away. After seeing that all the forces of the Belgae were coming together in one place and learning from the scouts and the Remi that they were not far off, Caesar hurried to cross the river Agzona, which was at the edge of the Remi's territory, and set up camp there. This position both protected one side of his camp with the riverbanks and made the area behind him safe from the enemy, ensuring that supplies could be brought to him from the Remi and other states without danger. There was a bridge over the river, and he stationed a garrison there, leaving Quintus Titurius Sabinus with 6 cohorts on the other side. He ordered the camp to be fortified with a rampart 12 feet high and a ditch 18 feet wide. About 8 miles from this camp was a town of the Remi named Bibrax. The Belgae began to assault it with great force as they marched. The town's defense barely held up that day. The method of assault used by the Gauls and Belgae was the same. When a large multitude of men surrounded the walls and began to throw stones from all sides at the wall, thus stripping the wall defenders, they would form a testudo, a formation with shields held overhead, and approach the gates, undermining the wall. This was easily done then because no one could stand on the wall due to the sheer volume of stones and projectiles being hurled. When night put an end to the assault, Iccius, a Remi of great nobility and influence among his people who was then in charge of the town and had been one of the envoys to Caesar seeking peace, sent a message to Caesar stating that if no reinforcements were sent, they could not hold out any longer. Using the same guides who had come with the message from Iccius, Caesar sent Numidian and Cretan archers and Balearic slingers to aid the townspeople in the middle of the night. With their arrival, the Remi gained the hope and enthusiasm needed to defend themselves, while the enemy's hope of capturing the town dwindled. Consequently, the Belgae, having stayed by the town for a while and ravaged the fields of the Remi, burned all the villages and buildings they could reach and then moved with all their forces towards Caesar's camp, setting up their own camp less than 2 miles away. As indicated by smoke and fires, their camp spread over a width of more than 8 miles. Caesar initially decided to avoid battle, both because of the large number of enemy forces and because of the exceptional reputation for bravery of the Belgae. However, he engaged in daily cavalry skirmishes to test the enemy's strength and our own troops' daring. Once he realized our men were not inferior, he chose a naturally advantageous position in front of the camp for setting up the battle line, as the hill where the camp was located was slightly elevated from the plain and extended in width only as much as the line could cover. On both sides, the hill had steep slopes, and in front, it gently sloped back to the plain. He drew a transverse trench on both sides of the hill about 400 paces long and positioned fortifications at the ends, placing artillery there to prevent the enemy, who were numerically superior, from outflanking his men during battle. After this, he left the 2 legions he had recently enlisted in the camp to act as reserves if needed and arranged the remaining 6 legions in a line in front of the camp. The enemy similarly drew out their forces from their camp and arranged them for battle. A small marsh lay between our army and the enemy's. The enemy expected us to cross this marsh, while we were prepared to attack if they started to cross it first. Meanwhile, cavalry skirmishes continued between the 2 lines. When neither side initiated crossing and our cavalry had a successful engagement, Caesar withdrew his troops to the camp. The enemy immediately moved from that position towards the river Agzona, which was behind our camp. Finding a ford, they attempted to cross part of their forces, aiming to attack the fort guarded by Legate Quintus Titurius and destroy the bridge, or, if they failed, to ravage the fields of the Remi, which were crucial for our supplies, and cut off our provisions. Upon receiving this information from Titurius, Caesar led all his cavalry, Numidian light infantry, slingers, and archers across the bridge and marched to confront the enemy. The fighting at that location was fierce. Our troops attacked the enemy as they were crossing the river, killing many of them, and repelled the rest who attempted to cross with a barrage of missiles. Those who had already crossed were surrounded and killed by our cavalry. When the enemy realized they had failed both to capture the fort and to cross the river, and they saw that our troops were not advancing into an unfavorable position, and their food supply was dwindling, they held a council and decided that the best course of action was for each man to return home, and that they should converge to defend those territories first entered by the Romans, preferring to fight on their own lands and use their domestic supplies. This decision was also influenced by the fact that they had learned Diviciacus and the Aedui were approaching the Bellovaci's territory, and they could not persuade their allies to stay and provide help. After making this decision, they left their camp during the second watch with great noise and disorder, moving without any specific order or command, each man seeking to be the first on the road and hurrying home, making their departure appear like a flight. Caesar, learning this from his scouts, fearing an ambush since he did not yet understand the reason for their departure, kept his army and cavalry in camp. At first light, once confirmed by scouts, he sent all his cavalry to delay the enemy's rear guard, led by legates Quintus Pedius and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta. He ordered legate Titus Labienus to follow with 3 legions. These forces attacked the rear guard and pursued them for many miles, killing a large number of the fleeing enemy. Those at the rear bravely resisted our soldiers' attacks, but the front ranks, seeing themselves out of danger and bound by neither necessity nor command, broke ranks upon hearing the cries, and all took flight for safety. Thus, without any risk, our soldiers killed as many of the enemy as the length of the day allowed, and at sunset, stopped their pursuit and returned to camp as ordered. The next day, before the enemy could recover from their fear and flight, Caesar led his army into the territory of the Susians, who were nearest to the Remi, and marched rapidly to the town of Novi Odunum. Attempting to take it by surprise as he had heard it was undefended, he found that the wide ditch and high walls, though defended by few, prevented its capture. After fortifying his camp, he began to build mantlets and prepare other siege equipment. Meanwhile, the entire force of the Susians, having fled from the previous battle, gathered in the town during the night. Quickly, Caesar brought the siege works close to the town, built a mound, and set up towers. The sheer magnitude of these operations, which the Gauls had neither seen nor heard of before, and the speed of the Romans, prompted the Susians to send envoys to Caesar to discuss surrender, and, at the Remi's request, they were granted protection. After receiving hostages, including the leading men of the state and the 2 sons of King Galba, and all the weapons from the town, Caesar accepted the surrender of the Susians and led his army into the territory of the Bellovaci. When the Bellovaci had taken themselves and all their belongings into the town of Ratispantium, and Caesar was about 5 miles from the town with his army, all the elders came out from the town, stretching out their hands to Caesar and signaling with their voices that they were coming into his protection and power, and that they would not fight against the Roman people. Likewise, when he approached the town and set up camp there, the boys and women, from the walls with outstretched hands in their customary manner, begged the Romans for peace. Diviciacus spoke on their behalf, for after the departure of the Belgae, he had dismissed the Aeduan forces and returned to Caesar. The Bellovaci had always been loyal and friendly to the Aeduan state. They had been driven to this by their leaders, who said that the Aedui had been reduced to servitude by Caesar, were enduring all sorts of indignities and insults, had defected from the Aedui, and had waged war against the Roman people. Those leaders who were the instigators of this plan, realizing the great calamity they had brought upon their state, had fled to Britain. The Bellovaci, not only on their own behalf, but also on behalf of the Aedui, were requesting that Caesar exercise his customary clemency and mildness toward them. If he did so, he would greatly enhance the Aedui's authority among all the Belgae, who, with their assistance and resources, had been accustomed to sustaining any wars that arose. Caesar, for the sake of Diviciacus and the Aedui, said he would receive the Bellovaci into his protection and spare them. Because this state was great among the Belgae in authority and number of men, he demanded 600 hostages. After they were handed over and all the weapons were collected from the town, he advanced from that place into the territory of the Ambiani, who immediately surrendered themselves and all their possessions. Their territory bordered on that of the Nervii. When Caesar inquired about the nature and customs of the Nervii, he learned the following. They allowed no merchants into their territory, and permitted no wine or other luxury goods to be imported, believing that such things weakened their resolve and diminished their valor. They were fierce men of great courage. They reproached and accused the other Belgae, who had surrendered to the Roman people and abandoned their ancestral valor, declaring that they themselves would neither send envoys nor accept any conditions of peace. After marching through their territory for 3 days, Caesar learned from prisoners that the river Savus was only about 10 miles from his camp. Across this river, all the Nervii had gathered and were awaiting the arrival of the Romans, along with the Atrebates and Viromandui, their neighbors, for they had persuaded both of these tribes to share the same fate in war. They were also expecting the forces of the Achuatusi, who were on their way, and they had sent their women and all who were too old to fight to a place where, because of the marshes, the Roman army would have no access. After learning these things, Caesar sent ahead scouts and centurions to choose a suitable place for a camp. As several of the Belgae who had surrendered and other Gauls were traveling with Caesar, some of them, as was later learned from prisoners, went to the Nervii by night and reported the daily route of the Roman army. They explained that a great number of baggage trains separated the legions, and that there would be no difficulty in attacking the first legion when it arrived in camp and was burdened with its packs, driving it off and plundering its baggage. They predicted that, with this legion driven off, the others would not dare to resist. This plan was also aided by the fact that the Nervii, being unable to use cavalry effectively, as they did not train for it and relied entirely on their infantry, had created a barrier by cutting and bending young trees and intertwining their branches, along with brambles and thorns, to form a hedge that provided a fortification like a wall, making it impossible to enter and even difficult to see through. With these obstacles, they intended to hinder the Roman column's march and saw no reason to abandon their plan. Before we begin with the next Caesar's battle against the Gauls, don't forget to subscribe. Let us begin. The location chosen by our men for their camp was this. A hill sloped evenly from its summit down to the river Savus, which we have mentioned earlier. On the opposite side of the river, a similar hill rose, sloping up in the same way, with a distance of about 200 paces at the lowest point, which was open ground, while the upper part was wooded, making it difficult to see far into the interior. The enemy was hiding within these woods, and a few cavalry posts could be seen in the open ground along the river. The river itself was about 3 feet deep. Caesar sent ahead his cavalry and followed with all his forces. However, the formation and order of his column were different from what the Belgae had reported to the Nervii. Since he was approaching the enemy, Caesar, following his usual practice, led 6 legions in light marching order. Behind them, he placed the baggage of the entire army, and then the 2 legions that had been recently recruited, which formed the rear guard and protected the baggage. Our cavalry, along with the slingers and archers, crossed the river and engaged the enemy cavalry. When the enemy repeatedly retreated into the woods to their own forces and then charged out again to attack our men, our troops did not dare to pursue them farther than the open ground extended. Meanwhile, the 6 legions that had arrived first began to fortify the camp. When the first part of the baggage train of our army was seen by those who were hiding in the woods, the enemy, as they had agreed, suddenly rushed out with all their forces and attacked our cavalry. Easily driving them back, they ran at incredible speed towards the river, so that almost at the same time they were seen in the woods, in the river, and upon us. With the same speed, they charged up the hill towards our camp and the men who were busy with the fortifications. Caesar had to attend to everything at once, raising the signal, which was the customary sign when troops should run to arms, sounding the trumpet, calling the soldiers back from their work, ordering those who had gone a little farther to gather materials for the rampart to be summoned, arranging the line of battle, encouraging the soldiers, and giving the signal. The shortness of time and the enemy's sudden attack hindered much of this. Two things helped in these difficulties: the knowledge and experience of the soldiers, who, having been trained in previous battles, could decide for themselves what needed to be done as conveniently as they could be instructed by others, and the fact that Caesar had forbidden the individual legates of each legion to leave their assigned positions until the camp was fortified. Because of the proximity and speed of the enemy, they did not wait for Caesar's command, but carried out what seemed appropriate on their own. Caesar, after giving the necessary orders, ran to encourage the soldiers and, by chance, came to the 10th Legion. He encouraged the soldiers briefly, reminding them to keep the memory of their former valor and not be disturbed in spirit, but bravely withstand the enemy's attack, as the enemy was no farther away than the distance a spear could be thrown. He gave the signal for battle. He then went to another part to encourage the soldiers and found them already engaged in the fight. The shortness of time and the enemy's resolve to fight were so great that there was no opportunity to adjust the standards or even to put on helmets and remove the covers from the shields. Each man, as he had come from his work, and whichever standards he first encountered, stood there so as not to lose time looking for his own unit. The army was arranged more by the nature of the location and the necessity of the moment than by military strategy and order, as the different legions resisted the enemy in different parts, with dense hedges, as described earlier, blocking the view, preventing a clear placement of reserves, and making it impossible to determine what was needed in each part or for a single commander to manage everything. Thus, the outcomes varied greatly due to the unevenness of the situation. The soldiers of the 9th and 10th Legions, positioned on the left side of the line, threw their spears and quickly drove the exhausted Adrovates, who had come to face them, from a higher position into the river, and pursuing them as they attempted to cross, killed a large number of them while they were hindered in the water. Without hesitation, they crossed the river themselves, advanced into an unfavorable position, and renewed the fight, driving the enemy back in flight. Likewise, in another part, the 11th and 8th Legions defeated the Viromandui they were fighting, drove them from the higher ground along the riverbanks. Meanwhile, nearly the entire camp was exposed from the front and left side. The 12th Legion and the 7th, stationed a short distance apart on the right wing, were attacked by the concentrated forces of the Nervii under the command of Boduognatus, who held supreme command. Part of the enemy began to encircle the legions from the open flank, while another part aimed for the top of the camp. At the same time, our cavalry and light-armed infantry, who had been with them and were initially driven back by the enemy's first attack, were retreating towards the camp, but encountered the enemy and fled in different directions again. The camp followers, who had come out from the back gate and the top of the hill for plundering, saw our victorious troops crossing the river, and when they looked back and saw the enemy in our camp, they fled headlong. Meanwhile, the clamor and noise arose from those approaching with the baggage, and many, terrified, scattered in different directions. The Treveri cavalry, who had a remarkable reputation for bravery among the Gauls and had come to Caesar as auxiliaries, saw the camp filled with a multitude of enemies, the legions under severe pressure and almost surrounded, and the camp followers, cavalry, slingers, and Numidians fleeing in all directions. They, despairing of our situation, hastened home, reporting to their state that the Romans had been defeated and routed, and the enemy had taken possession of their camp and baggage. Caesar, having moved from the 10th Legion to the right wing, saw his men being hard-pressed and the standards of the 12th Legion gathered in one place, with the soldiers so closely packed that they were hindering each other in the fight. All the centurions of the 4th cohort had been killed, the standard bearer had been slain, and the standard lost. Nearly all the centurions of the other cohorts were either wounded or killed, including the 1st centurion P. Sextius Baculus, a most valiant man, who was exhausted from multiple severe wounds and could no longer stand. The rest were becoming slower in their fight, and some of the rearmost, abandoning the battle, were retreating and avoiding the missiles. The enemy, attacking from both the lower ground in front and the flanks, pressed hard, and the situation was dire, with no reserves to send in. Caesar took a shield from a soldier in the rear, as he had come without one, and advanced to the front line. He called the centurions by name and encouraged the rest of the soldiers, ordering them to advance the standards and open up the ranks to allow them to use their swords more easily. His arrival brought hope to the soldiers and renewed their spirits, as each man, in the sight of their commander, was eager to show his valor even in such extreme circumstances, which slightly slowed the enemy's advance. Seeing the 7th Legion, which was positioned nearby, also being hard-pressed by the enemy, Caesar ordered the tribunes to gradually bring the legions together and turn their standards to face the enemy. When this was done, each man supported the other, and they began to resist more boldly and fight more bravely, no longer fearing being surrounded by the enemy while turned away. Meanwhile, the soldiers of the 2 legions that had been guarding the baggage at the rear, upon hearing of the battle, hurried forward and were seen by the enemy on the top of the hill. T. Labienus, having taken the enemy camp and observing from the higher ground what was happening in our camp, sent the 10th Legion to assist our men. When they learned from the flight of the cavalry and camp followers the state of affairs and the danger in which the camp, the legions, and the commander were, they left nothing undone to hasten their advance. If you are looking forward to see what is happening next, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next battle. Before we begin with the next Caesar's battle against the Gauls, don't forget to subscribe. Let us begin. Their arrival caused such a change in the situation that our men, even those who had collapsed from their wounds, supported themselves with their shields and renewed the fight. The camp followers, seeing the terrified enemy, armed themselves and confronted the armed foes. The cavalry, in an effort to erase the disgrace of their flight with their bravery, placed themselves in front of the legionary soldiers in all parts of the battle. The enemy, even in their last hope of salvation, showed such great valor that when their first ranks fell, the next stood on top of the fallen and fought from their bodies. When these were knocked down and their bodies piled up, those remaining would hurl their weapons at us from the mound and throw back our javelins that had been intercepted. Thus, it must be concluded that such men of great courage were not without reason willing to cross the widest river, climb the highest banks, and advance into the most unfavorable positions. Their courage had turned the most difficult tasks into easy ones. After this battle, which nearly annihilated the people and name of the Nervii, the elders, who, along with the boys and women, had been said to be thrown into the marshes and swamps, upon hearing of the battle, realized that nothing was safe for the defeated and nothing could impede the victors. With the unanimous consent of all the survivors, they sent envoys to Caesar and surrendered themselves to him. In recounting the calamity of their state, they said that out of 600 senators, only 3 had survived, and out of 60,000 people who could bear arms, scarcely 500 remained. Caesar, in a display of compassion towards the unfortunate and supplicants, carefully preserved them, allowed them to use their own territories and towns, and commanded their neighbors to protect them and their people from harm and injury. The Achuatuci, whom we mentioned earlier, were on their way to assist the Nervii with all their forces. Upon hearing of this battle, they turned back home from their march. They abandoned all their towns and strongholds and gathered all their possessions into one town, which was excellently fortified by nature. This town, surrounded by steep cliffs on all sides, had only one gentle slope for access, which was no more than 200 feet wide. This entrance was fortified with a double wall of great height, and they placed large stones and sharpened logs on the wall. The Achuatuci were descended from the Cimbri and Teutons, who, when making their way to our province and Italy, had left behind, on this side of the Rhine, all the baggage they could not carry or drive with them, along with 6,000 men to guard it. These men, after the death of the Cimbri and Teutons, were harassed by their neighbors for many years, sometimes waging war, sometimes defending themselves, and eventually, by common consent, had settled in this place as their home. Upon the first arrival of our army, they made frequent sallies from the town and engaged in small skirmishes with our troops. Later, having surrounded the town with a 12-foot rampart and numerous forts within a perimeter of 15 miles, they stayed within the town. When they saw our vines advancing and an embankment being constructed with a tower being set up at a distance, they began to ridicule it from the wall and mockingly ask with what mallets or what strength such small-statured men, for generally all Gauls despise our short height compared to their great size, could hope to place such a heavy tower on the wall. However, When they saw the tower moving and approaching the walls, disturbed by the strange and unprecedented sight, they sent envoys to Caesar to negotiate peace. They declared that they did not believe the Romans could wage war without divine help, being able to move such large machines with such speed, and they surrendered themselves and all their possessions to his power. They had only one request and plea: if, by his clemency and kindness, which they had heard so much about from others, he decided to spare the Atuatusi, he should not deprive them of their arms. They claimed that nearly all their neighbors were enemies and envied their valor. Without their arms, they would not be able to defend themselves. They preferred to endure any fate at the hands of the Roman people rather than be tortured to death by those over whom they had once ruled. To this, Caesar responded that he would preserve their state more out of his own custom than their deserving, provided they surrendered before the battering ram touched the wall. However, there was no condition of surrender other than the handing over of their arms. He said he would do as he had done with the Nervii and order their neighbors not to harm the surrendered people of the Roman people. Upon receiving this reply, they said they would comply with his demands. A large quantity of weapons was thrown from the wall into the trench in front of the town, forming piles nearly equal to the height of the wall and embankment. However, as later discovered, about a third of the weapons were hidden and kept inside the town. With the gates opened, they enjoyed peace that day. Towards evening, Caesar ordered the gates to be closed and the soldiers to leave the town, so the townspeople would not suffer any harm from the soldiers during the night. However, the townspeople had a prearranged plan, as it turned out. They believed that after surrendering, our troops would either withdraw their guard or at least keep it more laxly. Using the weapons they had hidden and retained, as well as shields made of bark or woven twigs covered with hides to meet the urgent need of the moment, they made a sudden attack with all their forces from the town during the third hour at the point where the ascent to our fortifications seemed least difficult. Quickly, as Caesar had previously ordered, fires were lit as signals, and troops rushed in from the nearby forts. The enemy fought fiercely, as men of courage would in their last hope of salvation, in a disadvantageous position against those who hurled weapons from the rampart and towers, relying solely on their bravery. About 4,000 of them were killed, and the rest were driven back into the town. The next day, after breaking through the gates, with no one left to defend them, and our soldiers led inside, Caesar sold the entire town as booty. The number of captives reported to him by the buyers was 53,000. At the same time, Caesar received news from Publius Crassus, whom he had sent with one legion to the Veneti, Venelli, Osismi, Coriosolite, Isuvi, Alerci, and Ridones, which are the maritime states reaching to the ocean, that all these states had been brought under the dominion and control of the Roman people. With these actions completed and all of Gaul pacified, the reputation of this war spread so widely among the barbarians that envoys from the nations living across the Rhine came to Caesar, promising to give hostages and obey his commands. Caesar, as he was hastening to Italy and Illyricum, ordered these envoys to return to him at the beginning of the next summer. He himself, after leading his legions into winter quarters among the Carnutes, Andes, and Turones, and the other states near the places where he had waged war, set out for Italy. For these achievements, based on Caesar's letters, a 15-day Thanksgiving was decreed, which had never before been granted to anyone. If you, like me, are looking forward to see what is happening next, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next battle. Thank you for watching this video. You definitively enjoyed it. Therefore, leave a like, please. He'd assure you are looking forward to see the next compendium. Subscribe to the channel for more videos and more of Caesar's adventures. He will see you, Legionary.